Our keynote speaker today is Brother Raymond Vercruysse, also an Edmund Rice Christian brother in this North American province. Brother Raymond began his teaching career in 1997 at Power Memorial Academy in New York City, a well-regarded high school with an energetic student body of young men who presented a wide range of cultures and abilities to challenge and expand the competencies of any educator. It was a wonderful introduction for Raymond's career. Raymond went on to serve in a number of high schools in North America and eventually completed the Doctor of Education degree at the University of San Francisco. He has also completed recently 8 years of service on the province leadership team for the brothers in North America. Raymond continues his long and generous service to the Catholic schools of North America in many distinct roles. For over a quarter of a century, he has been a frequent and popular speaker at the annual gathering of the National Catholic Education Association in the United States. His service also included high school president, director of the Institute for Catholic School Leadership at the University of San Francisco, vocation director for the North American Province of Christian Brothers, retreat director, facilitator, consultant, board member, and on and on. Ray has also been elected as a delegate to 3 general chapters of the Congregation of Christian Brothers. He is deeply informed on the life and charism of Edmund Rice, and we are pleased and grateful for his presence today. Raymond, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. As followers of Blessed Edmund Rice, we, like him, walk as advocates for those on the margins of society. Who defines the margins? Who qualifies as someone on the margins? These questions are wide open for clarification and definition. However, for Edmund, he kept his eyes and heart open to those he experienced and encountered. Paula Darcy, a North American author, spiritual writer, and retreat leader, once wrote, "God comes to you disguised as your life." For Edmund, his spiritual journey began by examining his life and surroundings and understanding how they formed his worldview. Seeing the poor of his day tugged at his heart and thus allowed him to become an advocate for those on the margins of society. Wonder is our birthright. It comes easily in childhood. The feeling of watching dust mites dancing in sunlight, or climbing a tree to touch the sky, or falling asleep thinking about where the universe ends. If we are safe and nurtured enough to develop our capacity to wonder, we start to wonder about the people in our lives too. Their thoughts and experiences, their pain and their joys, their needs and wants. We begin to sense that they are themselves as vast and complex as we are to ourselves. Their inner world is infinite as our own. In other words, we are seeing them as equal. We are gaining information about how to love them. Wonder really is the wellspring for love. With this insight, let us begin to look at a snapshot of Blessed Edmund Rice's life. So let us begin in Callan, where he grew up in a blended family of 7 siblings, having 2 stepsisters and a stepmother. Margaret Tierney was his primary educator. She taught him to be aware of the social cues and social justice issues that faced the Irish in the penal law society. It is reported that his mother would often invite other children in the village to a meal and took the opportunity to begin teaching them their Catholic faith and prayers. Edmund's education on these matters would continue at the local head school and later at Burrell Hall, a commercial school in Kilkenny. For Edmund, education was the means to make change happen in the lives of those on the margins of Callan. Even after his arrival in Waterford, Edmund encountered those still being persecuted under the penal laws. Thus, he began his work his advocacy work with those on the margins, suffering under the control of the English government and their representatives. For this presentation, I've divided my comments into 3 sections and a conclusion. I framed my comments in the congregation's goals of presence, compassion, and liberation. Presence. During Edmund's young adult life, his social position was important to him. His marriage to Mary Elliott would have had tremendous impact on him, and the birth of their daughter, Mary Rice, even more so. With the sudden death of Mary Elliott, Edmund's heart would ache for months. His love for her was true and passion-filled. Edmund often referred to this period of his life as dregs of misery and misfortune, but added, as one who had become an avid reader of the Bible, "The Lord gave and the Lord taketh away, so blessed be his name forever." But this was going to be a great turning point for him, a true test of his faith, much like St. Paul's fall from his horse. His life would be forever changed and no going back. To find some comfort after Mary Elliott's death, Edmund purchased the Bible and began to read it. This is significant in Edmund's life because as a layman, it was unheard of to purchase a 1791 edition of the Bible, let alone read it. Secondly, Edmund, along with other well-off business owners, began to attend daily Mass. He would often sit in the presence of the Eucharist to pray quietly, giving him some consolation. The birth of Mary Rice brought with it challenges that Edmund would face. Edmund had to come to terms with his own limitations. He faced these head-on, embracing his own human fragility. Therefore, I believe that it jettisoned Edmund on a journey which, through prayer, led him to become an advocate for those on the margins of society. Watching his daughter grow with the struggles allowed Edmund firsthand experiences that others faced with similar challenges. So Edmund had to make a rather difficult decision. That was to invite his stepsister, Joan Murphy, to join Mary and him. Realizing Edmund's love was not enough to meet Mary's needs as she grew into a woman, Joan would become Mary's primary caregiver until her death, allowing Edmund to pursue business ventures and later his religious vocation. Edmund, being drawn to the life of a religious, had his eyes opened by Mary Power, who simply asked him to look out the window and tell her what he saw. In his response, he stated that he saw poor Catholic boys wandering the streets with no purpose and no hope for a future. His heart was deeply touched in a way that he could make a difference by starting to educate them. So Mount Zion was started and the Congregation of Christian Brothers began in 1802. Another dimension of being an advocate is having your heart affected by your engagement with those in situations that are far from ordinary. Thus, not just in giving or helping another, you become transformed and changed, but you truly feel the pain and grow from this, and growing from this become whole. Edmund knew that being present to an individual was his first step in breaking out the barriers that divided the individuals. The penal law did not help, and being governed by the English landlords was not the answer either. So Edmund began to contribute to the change that was needed by educating young boys along the docks of Waterford. Not only started a school to educate them, but he also would reach out to feed them physically and spiritually. Soon his reputation would spread as others heard the good works he and his companions were doing for the youth of Waterford and their families. Early in the life of the congregation, Edmund would often visit prisoners and be called on to walk with individuals sentenced to the gallows near John's Bridge. His presence and prayers brought hope to them and reassurance that God loved them. Edmund learned that at a time when hope was lost, he could be a presence to them and allow them satisfaction in their last hours. During the 1832 Asiatic cholera pandemic, the school in Thurles and Limerick was converted to a hospital ward, and Edmund and the brothers assisted in the care of those patients. These individuals saw their lives slipping away, and in despair, Edmund and his brothers gave them hope that God would meet them with open arms in the next life, a rather familiar scene which we find ourselves in today. Compassion. Pope Francis writes, accompaniment means compassionate presence and availability, a description that aptly describes Edmund Rice. The word compassion can be interpreted in a variety of ways, but for Edmund, it started with his heart and the ability to feel the pain of another. Edmund would often visit patients in local hospitals to lift their spirits. Here's a story. A story was told about Pole Carthy, who was an alcoholic. She would walk the streets of Waterford, terrorizing the citizens with verbal and physical abuse. After some time watching people's reactions, Edmund stood up to her and persuaded her to seek the help of Father Matthew Theobald in court. She was so taken by Edmund's intervention that she did as he asked and took herself to court. Months later, and sober, she returned where she again encountered the good citizens of Waterford. To her surprise, they did not recognize her. When she finally came across Edmund, she fell to her knees and thanked him from the bottom of her heart for the help which had changed her life. Edmund simply said, "You did the work of changing your ways." Compassion overcame Edmund. I found being compassionate teaches us a great deal about ourselves. I believe this was true regarding Edmund. It often helps deepen the development and accelerates the growth we desire, which I feel is an outcome when we allow our students to be engaged in opportunities where they can recognize the compassionate person they are being called to be. Walking the streets of Waterford, Edmund came across an Italian immigrant begging for money. Having his heart so moved, he offered his assistance to Carlo Bianconi in a different way. He brought him to the presentation sisters and asked them for their assistance in educating Carlo. When the task at hand was reached, Carlo became a well-respected citizen in the Waterford community. So much so that he established the first road car service connecting villages and towns throughout Ireland. Again, having his heart touched by the plight of this holy child of God, Edmund became an advocate for justice and rehabilitation of the individual. St. Francis of Assisi wrote, "Before you speak a peace, you must first have it in your heart." I believe this principle applies to Edmund's heart. Before he reached out to make a difference in the lives of others, he needed to know firsthand the love of God in his own heart. I think this occurred with the death of his beloved wife and the birth of his daughter and his encounters with others in Waterford. Shortly after Edmund took over his Uncle Michael's business, Edmund became well known along the docks of Waterford. So when he encountered a ship captain's ill treatment of one of his workers, a slave, Edmund was moved to correct the wrong. Edmund proceeded to purchase the young lad and to give him his freedom and dignity back as a free man. For some, this action has been questioned over time, but I believe that Edmund was truly acting as an advocate for justice in the case of Black Johnny. Much like his efforts with Carlo Bianconi, he brought Johnny to the presentation sisters for an education. The intervention was again successful, and years later, Johnny becomes the mayor of Clonmel. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "To develop understanding, you have to practice looking at all living beings with the eyes of compassion. When you understand, you love. And when you love, you naturally act in a way that can relieve the suffering of people." I believe Edmund lived his life this way, and thus those who follow in his footsteps as members of the Edmund Rice Network strive to do likewise. The women in Edmund's life taught him by their example to love and be compassionate towards others, beginning with his mother, Margaret Tierney, followed by his wife, Mary Elliott, and the birth of Mary Rice. A major turning point in Edmund's life came from a conversation with Mary Power and his recognition of the work that Nano Nagel's sisters were doing for young women, thus drawing him in a way to do the same for young boys. Entering deeply into his spiritual life, Edmund was deeply impacted by the writings of Teresa of Avila, which allowed Edmund to fully understand the love the Blessed Mother had for her son. Coretta Scott King wrote, "The greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. A heart of grace and a soul generated by love. This is what led Edmund deeply to live a compassion-filled life as a religious brother." Liberation. Gandhi wrote, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." Edmund, through the opportunities he was exposed to, knew that having an education would give the individual the ability to make a difference in their own lives. They would not need to depend on others and follow blindly. They would understand right from wrong and become aware of justice-related behaviors. Edmund believed that the beginning of advocacy is education, reflection, and discernment. These actions led individuals to a feeling of being liberated from the social barriers inhibiting them from fully becoming whole and loving individuals as God meant them to be. Following this presentation, you'll hear more examples of this. But St. Hildegard wrote that speaking out on injustice allows one to hear the inner voice of God. Edmund did listen and see the injustices that his fellow countrymen were experiencing. He knew that life could be different and needed to be different, but the question was where to start. For Edmund, the answer was simple. It was education. Richard Rohr once wrote in one of his daily meditations that true contemplation is the most subversive of activities because it undercuts the one thing that normally refuses to give way, our natural individualism and narcissism. Once we are freed from our narcissism that thinks we are the center of the world, or that our rights and dignity have to be defended by other people's rights and dignities, we can finally live and act with justice and truth. People do not really change by themselves. God changes us if we can expose ourselves to God at a deep level. A dimension of advocacy is transformation. As important and as action is, it is the attitude, a way of perceiving that determines the depth and extent of one's freedom to change. This change is what leads to transformation and in turn leads to liberation. This is where God is speaking to each of us. Edmund fully realized that deep commitment to a prayer life was at the very root of his compassionate response to liberate those on the margins from injustice that put them there. The Reverend Howard Thurman, a theologian and mystic of his own right, reflected on the creative tension that exists between innocence and knowledge. He wrote, "With the coming of knowledge, they have lost their innocence. The transition from innocence to knowledge is always perilous and fraught with hazard. There is something very comforting and reassuring about innocence. To dwell in innocence is to inhabit a region where storms do not come and where all the breezes are gentle and balmy. This is to live in the calm of the eye of the hurricane. It is to live in the static environment which makes upon the individual no demands other than to be. All else is cared for, is guaranteed. But when knowledge comes, the whole world is turned upside down. The meaning of things begins to emerge, and more importantly, the relationship between things are seen for the first time. Questions are asked and answers are sought. A strange restlessness comes over the spirit, and the enormity of error moves over the horizon like a vast shadow. Struggle emerges as the way of life. An appetite is awakened that can never be satisfied. A person becomes conscious of himself or herself. The urge to know, to understand, to find answers turns inward. Every estimate of others becomes a question of self-estimate. Every judgment upon life becomes self-judgment. The question of meaning of one's self becomes one with the meaning of life. This process of movement from innocence to knowledge is never finished. Always there is a realm of innocence. Always there is some area of innocence untouched by knowledge. The more profound the growth of knowledge, the more aware the individual becomes of the dimensions of innocence. Pride in knowledge is always tempered by the dominion of innocence. I believe this is what Edmund felt by educating the young. It allowed them a knowledge base that would be wider than what they were aware of, and they would become individuals of change. The work being done in advocacy in our ministry sites is allowing individuals who may not realize they are innocent to become aware through knowledge of the injustice perpetrated in our society. Thus, through this newfound knowledge, along with discernment and reflection, they can be first transformed themselves and then lead a transformative life, influencing others in a positive way, much like Edmund Rice and those in the Edmund Rice Network do today. For Edmund, a deep prayer life and the ability to spend time in quiet contemplation was important. It was here that his heart could hear the cries of the poor and those on the margins of society. It is here that Edmund could truly become an advocate for social justice and issues facing those on the margins of the Irish society of his day. It is here that ministries being conducted in the name of Edmund Rice Christian Brothers can impact positively our society by engaging the young people in our care to see differently, to hear differently, to feel differently, thus acting differently. For Edmund, presence was being in a relationship with a person, seeing the face of God in them. Just as Victor Hugo wrote in Les Miserables, in which Jean Valjean sings, "To love another person is to see the face of God." Edmund had the uncanny ability to see the face of God in those he served. When possible, his heart could respond in a compassionate manner. Thus, the end result would be liberating them from forces that suppressed them and kept them on the margins of an unjust society. In conclusion, I highlighted some aspects of Edmund's spiritual journey on his role to be an advocate. Following this presentation, you'll hear from individuals who have assisted young people to be Edmund on the ground in the 21st century. As followers of Edmund, let our hearts burn with the love of Jesus and Edmund. Let us help others be a mirror of God's presence, compassion, and liberating power in our society. So let me close with this quote from Proverbs. "By wisdom, a house is built, and through understanding, it is established. Through knowledge, its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures.